Good evening. Will the Standing Committee on Justice please come to order? Before the committee can proceed with the business before it, it must elect a chairperson. Are there any nominations? Honorable Mr. Gertson?
I would like to nominate the individual who I refer to as the most honest person in politics, the MLA for La-Vérendrye, Mr. Smook.
Mr. Smook has been nominated. Are there any other nominations? Hearing no other nominations, Mr. Smook, will you please take the chair?
Our next item of business is the election of a vice chairperson. Are there any nominations? The Honorable Mr. Gertson.
The most earnest man in politics, the MLA for McPhillips, Mr. Martin.
Mr. Martin has been nominated. Are there any other nominations? Hearing no other nominations, Mr. Martin is elected vice chairperson. This meeting has been called to consider the following bills. Bill number 11, the Reducing Red Tape and Improving Services Act 2023. Bill number 17, the Regulated Health Professionals Amendment Act, number 2 brackets. Bill number 26, the Limitations Amendment and Public Officers Amendment Act. Bill number 34, the Police Services Amendment Act. I would like to inform all in attendance of the provisions in our rules regarding the hour of adjournment. A standing committee meeting to consider a bill must not sit past midnight to hear public presentations or to consider clause by clause of a bill, except by unanimous consent of the committee. Written submissions from the following persons have been received and distributed to committee members. Pamela Gregoire, Remedial Massage Therapist Society of Manitoba on Bill number 17. Cam Blight, Association of Manitoba Municipalities on Bill 34. Kathy Merrick, Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs on Bill number 34. Crystal Brown, Southern Chiefs Organization on Bill number 34. Does the committee agree to have these documents appear in the Hansard transcript of this meeting? Agreed and so ordered. Prior to proceeding with public presentations, I would like to advise members of the public regarding the process for speaking in a committee. In accordance with our rules, a time limit of 10 minutes has been allotted for presentations, with another 5 minutes allowed for questions from committee members. Questions shall not exceed 30 seconds in length, with no time limit for answers. Questions may be addressed to presenters in the following rotation. First, the minister sponsoring the bill. Second, a member of the official opposition. And third, an independent member. If a presenter is not present, is not in attendance when their name is called, they will be dropped to the bottom of the list. If the presenter is not in attendance when their name is called a second time, they will be removed from the presenter's list. The proceedings of our meetings are recorded in order to provide a verbatim transcript. Each time someone wishes to speak, whether it be an MLA or a presenter, I first have to say the person's name. This is the signal for the Hansard recorder to turn the mics on and off. Thank you for your patience. We will now proceed with public presentations. On Bill number 34, Mr. Mike Sutherland, Manitoba Nurses Union.
And he's online.
And I believe Mr. Sutherland is online. Mr. Sutherland, are you there?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I am.
You may proceed with your presentation when you are ready to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, and thank you, committee members, for the opportunity to present our thoughts on the Police Services Amendment Act. I'm here on behalf of the Manitoba Nurses Union, which represents over 12,000 nurses in our province. Among its many functions, the MNU is dedicated to advocating for the improvement of the safety in healthcare facilities that both patients and our members find themselves in. Unfortunately, violence has become an ever-increasing and pressing issue in healthcare, as it has in so many other public sector services and spaces. When violence in provincially owned liquor stores became an issue, this government rolled out extensive security infrastructure and identification requirements for entry. Sized instances of violence on Winnipeg public transit, this government is introducing amendments contained in this bill to facilitate the enhancement of community safety officers' powers so that municipalities may use them to address, among other things, the security issues in public transit. While I'm not here to question the need for or the value of these additional security measures, I am here to question why a similar concern for the safety and security at healthcare facilities is not evident in this bill. It deals with institutional safety officers, or ISOs. It is my hope that the committee will indulge me for a few minutes as I discuss the issue of ISOs. While I recognize that this bill does not make changes to that part of the Act, I feel that some discussions of ISOs is justified given the fact that the Honourable Minister of Justice has repeatedly raised and endorsed this bill in the Chamber when asked about the issue of the lack of ISOs in healthcare facilities. I believe that his insistence on conflating, or at the very least tying together, the issues of ISOs and enhance the creation of institutional safety officers. Our president and two other representatives from MNU, along with top leadership of HSC at the time, were pitched by department staff that this would be the answer to the violence that was occurring in healthcare facilities. The amendments creating ISOs were passed in May of 2019 and later not proclaimed until October of 2021. And we know as of quite recently that there have been virtually no ISOs trained and deployed as such in healthcare facilities in the province. Apparently one singular security staff member from the Health Sciences Centre recently completed the necessary training, though the facility does not yet have an ISO program in place. Clearly, when 4 years have passed following the passage of necessary amendments, there is no other way to categorize the situation around ISOs as other than an unfulfilled promise. In fact, at this point, MNU has lost much faith that this government cares about patient or nurse safety or intends to do anything to improve the security at healthcare facilities via ISOs or otherwise. When asked about the lack of ISOs by another member of the legislature, the minister recently responded, quote, "Institutional safety officers are available to those who choose to use them. There are also community safety officers whose powers are being expanded by legislation that is currently before the legislature," unquote. He went on to say, "I look forward to the member opposite, if he's actually concerned about these issues, to quickly passing that piece of legislation." Should we therefore expect that upon passage of this bill, that CSOs will be responding to incidents of violence at healthcare facilities? Are the powers of CSOs being expanded to fill the void that exists due to the lack of institutional safety officers? Will CSOs be posted at or near healthcare facilities to provide an immediate response to security issues that arise? Unfortunately, despite these comments from the minister, there is currently no evidence to indicate that the municipalities requesting these enhancements to the powers of CSOs actually intend for them to be used to address security issues at healthcare facilities. Clarification on this point, whether CSOs can act as a substitute for ISOs at healthcare facilities, ought to be provided when discussing the merits of this bill. Our members cannot accept the government again dangling potential solutions to their security concerns in front of them while having no intention to support the implementation of these solutions or to address the underlying issues and threats that give rise to the need for such solutions. We would appreciate some clarification on this point of whether CSOs will be able to provide the much needed security that is currently lacking in our healthcare facilities due to the absence of ISOs. Among the amendments being made in this bill to the CSO and First Nation officer parts of the Police Services Act is the addition of sections that explicitly address the ability of CSOs and FNOs to detain persons posing a safety threat. These amendments state the following: a community safety officer or First Nations officer may detain a person posing a safety threat whom they encounter in a situation in subsection 2 regarding initial response to situations that pose a safety threat that they encounter while performing their duties until they are satisfied that the person no longer poses a safety threat. Institutional safety officers under this bill. While ISOs can presumably exercise some capacity to detain persons posing a threat, as the regulations allow them to carry handcuffs, mentions taking people into custody and apprehending people in certain instances, it is troubling that the same explicit recognition of this right to detain is not being added to the ISO part of the Police Services Act under this bill. It seems that while this bill is intended to enhance the role and facilitate the use of CSOs and FNOs, there is no such concern with making improvements to the part of the Police Services Act relating to ISOs. Codifying in the Act the ability of ISOs to detain people posing a safety threat would be an improvement and meaningful clarification. It is not clear to us why this is being done to the CSO and FNO parts of the Act, but not the ISO part. It would appear that the government is intent on creating a rather scattered approach to security services and security personnel categories. The Police Services Act contains sections allowing for CSOs, FNOs, ISOs, and special constables, all in addition to regular police. Is this really the most practical approach to managing public safety and security issues in Manitoba? Multiplying categories or types of officers that can respond to certain security issues in different settings in many ways creates confusion and downloads responsibility for safety onto various other local level jurisdictions, organizations, and institutions, rather than continuing to add categories or change the roles and powers of these additional security personnel. Would it not be more clear-cut and practical to create a cadre of provincial sheriffs funded and managed by the province to address the security issues that cannot be typically or reasonably handled by local police? While MNU is not opposing the bill, we certainly wish to point out that it does not sufficiently address the lack of action on or issues associated with ISOs. Furthermore, it does not offer a satisfactory, straightforward approach to dealing with the security issues that now often arise in public healthcare spaces. Local police services are no longer able to meet the demand for their services that now exist in all public spaces. We understand this. However, creating a complex array of various types of security personnel managed by different jurisdictions, organizations, or institutions to address this excess demand is not the optimal approach. We respectfully suggest that at the very least, the bill should make amendments to the ISO part of the Police Services Act to clearly and explicitly recognize the ability of ISOs to detain persons posing safety threats. And furthermore, we wish to suggest that perhaps the government could rethink its legislative approach to how it intends to deal with the limited capacity of local police to address the additional and overwhelming demand that exists, simply because the province has created a category for them under this legislation is not, I submit, a satisfactory response to this issue. The province needs to take greater ownership of the safety of Manitobans than this current approach demonstrates. Thank you very much.
We thank you for your presentation, Mr. Sutherland. The floor is now open to questions from the members. The Honourable Mr. Gertson.
Just a comment. Thank you, Mike. It's good to see you again in this context. I know we've talked in different contexts in the past. In terms of ISOs, so certainly, as you mentioned, the City of Winnipeg and this being part for the transit unit, you'll know that those won't be employees of the Department of Justice, nor with MLCC. The security issues were dealt with by the corporation. Have you had discussions with Shared Health regarding hiring of ISOs which are already being trained?
Mr. Sutherland?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Can you hear me?
Sorry, Mr. Chair. I didn't wait to be recognized. My apologies. It's been a while since I've done this. A number of years ago, I did have discussions with Shared Health personnel in relation to the ISO situation. The challenge, of course, being that we had expected that there would be some tangible evidence that they would be moving to some sort of a training program and some measures to meaningfully introduce and get the ball rolling. But those never came to fruition. And so we've sort of been left in limbo in relation to some 4 years later now, and it probably was about at least 2 or 3 years ago that we entertained these initial discussions, and there was, at least initially, some significant optimism in relation to having institutional safety officers in our healthcare institutions, which are, of course, a provincial responsibility.
I mean, I can certainly hear your frustration here that you're bringing to the committee. I think it's important that all committee members hear it. I know that the Minister of Health, I'm sure, is listening very carefully as well. I'm just trying to understand: is there any way under what the bill that we're seeing here? Is there any way that you believe that CSOs could be helpful in providing some kind of safety or security to your members? Or, I mean, do you really feel like are the ISOs with some,
members'
enhanced
time has expired? Mr. Sutherland?
We should make it 45 seconds.
I think in terms of what is required in healthcare, given what we are seeing not only in Manitoba, but unfortunately throughout the country, post-pandemic, with the rise of individuals with significant mental health distress, addictions, etc., our healthcare facilities are certainly experiencing a much greater occurrence of violence, and in many cases, unfortunately, the degree to which that violence is more acute is also often on the rise. Having a dedicated, capable, well-trained, well-equipped, a difficulty in terms of if a CSO, for example, were to have a number of different priorities and the healthcare facility under his jurisdiction or her jurisdiction or their jurisdiction being only one of many priorities, I think the risk becomes that without a dedicated security presence, where volatility can occur sometimes quite quickly and unexpectedly, I think is not best addressed by having sort of a myriad of approaches, but having a dedicated and properly funded and resourced approach.
Are there any further questions? We thank you for your presentation, Mr. Sutherland, and we will now move on to the next presenter. Mr. Michael Anderson. Is Mr. Anderson here? Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Do you have any written submissions for the committee?
I do, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
I see there being...
And if it's necessary, I would ask that the committee receive the submission and publish it in the Hansard.
Just to let you know, Mr. Anderson, you may have a presentation, like a speech one or a written one, but not both, because whatever you say will be recorded in Hansard, and the written one would usually is the same as what you're saying. So you're not allowed both, only one?
I'll proceed with my oral submission then, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Okay, if you're ready to proceed, you may proceed. Mr. Michael Anderson.
Thank you. My name is Michael Anderson. I'm the Policing and Public Safety Advisor for the Manitoba Kiiwet Nui Okimakanak. And we've been working closely with officials from the Department of Justice on a variety of justice-related initiatives to improve the safety of First Nation communities. Grand Chief Settee has discussed with Minister Goertzen frequently our vision of a whole-of-government response, and Bill 34 fits into that. MKO supports the proposed amendments to the Police Services Act as set out in Bill 34, which confers the powers and protections of a peace officer on First Nation safety officers. The amendments are an essential tool to enhance the role and authority of First Nation safety officers, who play a critical role as first responders in the often extended absence of police to the epidemic of bootlegging and drug dealing that is plaguing many of our First Nations and creating states of emergency that have been recently declared by many MKO First Nations. The present Police Services Act does not clearly and statutorily confer the powers and protections of a peace officer when a First Nation safety officer is necessarily acting as a first responder in the extended absence of police in response to a nearly 40% violent crime rate in First Nations that's largely driven by a virtually uncontrolled epidemic of bootlegging and drug dealing and the complex of personal and community harms arising from addictions. Bill 34 potentially enhances the role and authority of First Nation safety officers to act as first responders with the powers and protections of a peace officer, when acting in the often extended absence of police. The present Police Services Act does not clearly and statutorily confer the powers and protections of a peace officer when a First Nation safety officer is enforcing First Nation laws enacted pursuant to the Framework Agreement on First Nation Land Management or a bylaw directed to the health and safety of First Nations communities enacted pursuant to Section 81.1 or 85.1 of the Indian Act. The province is the constitutional authority which confers peace officer status upon persons acting as police and peace officers in the province. There is no federal statute to confer the powers and protections of a peace officer on First Nation safety officers when enforcing First Nation laws and bylaws on the reserves of a First Nation or any enforcement officer appointed or retained by a First Nation. This is a provincial authority. Bill 34 has the potential to provide important clarity for the role and authority of First Nation safety officers to act with the powers and protections of a peace officer when enforcing First Nation laws enacted pursuant to the Framework Agreement on First Nation Land Management Act and Indian Act bylaws. The new ministerial regulation to be enacted by Section 77.16 sub 1 as amended by Bill 34 and which would designate as, quote, prescribed enactments First Nation laws enacted pursuant to the Framework Agreement on First Nation Land Management Act and bylaws enacted pursuant to Section 81.1 and 85.1 of the Indian Act would provide important clarity and certainty regarding the enforcement by First Nation safety officers of First Nation laws and bylaws, and by police, for that matter. The Manitoba Police Services Act applies as a provincial law of general application to First Nation reserve lands under Section 88 of the Indian Act. The constitutional authority of the province to legislate in respect of the administration of justice in the provinces is established by Section 9214 of the British North America Act 1867. The amendment set out in Bill 34 will apply to reserve lands and to the role and authority of First Nation safety officers acting on reserve lands. Section 2 of the Police Services Act says that the minister is responsible for ensuring that adequate and effective policing is provided throughout Manitoba, including on a First Nation reserve. RCMP are the police service in 25 of the 26 MKO First Nations because Manitoba has contracted Canada to provide and maintain a provincial police service within the province, pursuant to Section 2, Sub 1 of the April 1st, 2012 Provincial Police Service Agreement. Through the Provincial Police Service Agreement, Canada has designated members and support staff of the RCMP to form and serve as the provincial police. That is, RCMP serve the majority of First Nation communities in Manitoba because MKO has contracted Canada to provide the RCMP as the provincial police service and not because RCMP are a federal police service that are policing federal lands. That is, to reiterate, the provincial minister is constitutionally responsible for the administration of justice in the province and is statutorily responsible for ensuring that adequate and effective policing is provided throughout Manitoba, including in First Nation communities. A bylaw that is properly enacted by a First Nation pursuant to the authority of council under Section 81.1 and 85.1 of the Indian Act unquestionably has the force and effect of a federal regulation and is a law of Canada, pursuant to the Federal Interpretation Act, the Federal Statutory Instruments Act, and the Federal Statutory Instruments Regulation. The RCMP have a duty to enforce a First Nation bylaw pursuant to Section 18A of the RCMP Act. The Public Prosecution Service of Canada has jurisdiction to prosecute offences of First Nation bylaws pursuant to the Federal Director of Public Prosecutions Act. MKO assesses that First Nation bylaws have not been regularly enforced by RCMP or prosecuted by federal prosecutors for the past 27 years. Bill 34 has the potential to enhance the recognition and enforcement of First Nation bylaws and laws by police and First Nation safety officers. The proposed amendments to the Police Services Act set out in Bill 34 were briefly presented to MKO by the Provincial Executive Director of Policing Services and Public Safety, and we thank the Minister and his staff for that. It's the recollection of MKO that the proposed amendments were discussed once with the Provincial Justice Working Group that includes senior officials of Manitoba Department of Justice, MKO, AMC, and SCO. Although MKO has previously collaborated with Manitoba Justice in drafting of provincial legislation, we did not directly participate in the drafting of Bill 34. One of the things I would say, though, is that at the request of MKO, despite that we didn't directly on it, the significance of peace officer status designation has been a part of our ongoing discussions. Further to the work that we were doing with the provincial government, the First Nations Safety Officer operating agreements were amended in 2021 at paragraph 22 to acknowledge that Manitoba acknowledges that First Nations possess the authority to make and enforce bylaws in accordance with Section 81.1 and 85.1 of the Indian Act. And that was tied together with an earlier provision of the operating agreement at 19.2 as provided by subsection 7716-sub 2 of the Police Services Act. A First Nations safety officer has the powers and the protections of a peace officer while on duty and while enforcing lawful safety-related First Nation bylaws were authorized to do so by the First Nation. So we've been working with Manitoba to connect all these dots to make sure that our First Nations have clear peace officer authority and status when enforcing ban bylaws that are designed and targeted to health and safety, and in particular Section 85.1 intoxicants prohibitions. One of the reasons that this has become important is that our First Nations, of course, have also been asking the Minister and the staff at the Manitoba Department of Justice to work with us in discussions with infrastructure and transportation, for example, to enable searches at airports and at ferries to try to interdict the drug supply and alcohol that's coming into the communities. We've been working closely with Canada Post, who under the non-mailable matter regulations of the Canada Post Corporations Act have the authority to search every piece of non-letter mail that enters the system from the moment it's mailed to the moment it's delivered to the recipient. Not even the RCMP have that authority. It's warrantless searches of mail. So we're trying to put all the pieces together to create a comprehensive scheme to work with RCMP, Manitoba Justice, Canada Post, the federal government to interdict drugs and alcohol entering our community, but recognizing that wellness programs to address the interdicted supplies of drug and alcohol have to go consistent with our enforcement and prosecution activities. We don't see this as a project where we're enforcing our way out of this issue. We don't see this as an initiative to prosecute our way out of this issue. What we see is an integrated program of wellness and integrated prosecution and enforcement, targeted enforcement we call it, to create a whole of government response with a wellness focus. That is, through targeted enforcement with the appropriate level of potential prosecution, streaming through our restorative justice process and program, where we can take individuals, for example, that may have been charged under a Section 85.1 intoxicants prohibition and stream them into addictions medicine, managed alcohol, mental wellness supports, or all three, delivered in the community. So Bill 34 represents some important tools to help this vision come to life.
Unfortunately, Mr. Anderson, your time has expired. The Honourable...
I got a sense, and I know Michael well enough to know, I think he was just wrapping up, but I suspect if we give him another minute, he'll be able to conclude.
Oh, sorry.
I believe.
Sorry.
It's a leave request. We need leave for this.
Yes, it's a leave request. Is there leave to allow Mr. Anderson to complete his statement? Leave has been agreed. Mr. Anderson, you may complete your statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Minister, and members of the committee. So these tools that are being developed in Bill 34 are critical to our overall vision of a whole of government response by strengthening the aspect of targeted enforcement and keeping in mind that we do not see the vision or the paradigm of enforcement, prosecution, and incarceration as our model. Our model is a wellness-focused, but we need to be able to have it. Our citizens believe that there will be consequences for behaviors that are not acceptable to the community through targeted enforcement and prosecution, and this allows our First Nations safety officers additional authority in that role. And so with that additional set of comments, Mr. Chair, I thank you.
We thank you for your presentation, Mr. Anderson. We will now proceed with questions. The Honorable Mr. Gertson.
More a comment than a question. Thanks, Michael. It's good to see you again. I know we just were together at a meeting a few days ago on a similar topic, related topic. And so we appreciate the work you and MKO are doing and working with the department, and pass along our thanks to the Grand Chief and others at MKO for their assistance in this.
Mr. Anderson, I have to recognize you before you speak, so you may now speak.
For the Hansard, it's Michael Anderson speaking, and I thank you, Minister. And I will convey your good wishes and words to Grand Chief Settee and the rest of our team. Thank you for that.
Mr. Wiebe.
Mr. Anderson, thank you so much for the work that you do. It's incredible to hear your perspective and to understand a little bit more about how we can partner with you. My question is though, is there any kind of provincial funding that's coming along with this this bill? Have you had any discussions about that? Any other supports that might be made available to MKO, to your First Nations, that might be helpful in achieving the goals that you're so diligently working towards?
Mr. Anderson, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The First Nation Safety Officer Program is funded under the First Nation Inuit Policing Program, funded 52% by Canada and 48% by Manitoba. We have, of course, as you would expect, been pursuing increases in that program to provide for additional salary levels, which has recently been in effect for this year. And we're also working on discussing the significance of the Safety Officer Program with our colleagues in Public Safety Canada, so that we have proper equipment, supplies, and resources. Many of our safety officers use their personal cell phones. A lot of our counselors are pulling cash out of their wallets to pay for gas for vehicles. And basically, all of the non-salary costs of the Safety Officer Program, all of them, are funded directly by the First Nation. So it shows you the commitment of First Nations to public safety. We did approximately 2/3 to 3/4 of the total cost of public safety in any FNSO-funded First Nation is paid for by the First Nation. In a survey we did in 2012, we calculated 19 of 30 respondent MKO First Nations were spending $4.3 million on public safety, and $1.2 is coming through the program. At that time, it was Solicitor General, not this program, but it shows you the variation in cost. Nissachawassa Cree Nation uses some of its interest monies for its hydro settlement to pay for their safety officers, and so forth. So it's a high level of commitment. Our First Nations find the money wherever they can to prioritize public safety. The province is aware of this because we are very clear in articulating as we are tonight, and so is Public Safety Canada. So we're encouraging both partners to recognize the significance of our direct efforts of public safety through our safety officers.
Are there any further questions? Seeing no further questions, we thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Anderson, and we will. This concludes the list of presenters I have before me. In what order does the committee wish to proceed with clause-by-clause consideration of these bills? The Honourable Mr. Gertson.
Just to prevent a bit of unnecessary shuffling, I wonder if we can do Bill 11, 26, 34, and then 17.
Is that agreed to by the committee, that we proceed with bills
11, 26, 34, 17.
11, 26, 34, 17? Agreed and so ordered. We will now proceed to clause by clause of Bill number 11. Does the minister responsible for Bill number 11 have an opening statement? The Honourable Mr. Gertson.
Only to repeat a similar statement that I made yesterday, that this is a bit of an omnibus bill, but not an ominous bill, and that it has different provisions that come from different departments amending acts that aren't specific to justice, but I know there was some discussion about the Amusements Act in particular, and the changes to the resale of tickets, which have been requested, I think, by True North, among others, because the antiquated system that we have now doesn't reflect the reality when it comes to the reselling of tickets, where individuals can go onto online sites that are out of province and buy tickets on the resale market at higher prices, but without any protections necessarily that are created in Manitoba. So I believe that the minister responsible for that bill is committed to bringing forward a mechanism for greater consumer protection that exists now. And then there is an amendment by the City of Winnipeg. It's a charter amendment that they've asked in terms of mailing out documents, emailing them out, instead of mailing them out, and then allowing paramedics to direct traffic, because they're often the first on scene of an accident, and then the Teachers Pensions Act to allow TRAF to have more flexibility. I know there's members here who've often taken an interest in the TRAF board before and made some changes to it. So I hope that these relatively small but important changes are agreeable to the committee.
We thank the minister for those comments. Does the critic from the official opposition have an opening statement? Mr. Wiebe.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'll make the same comment I made yesterday with regards to the minister's quip about omnibus versus ominous, and the fact that, of course, this bill being titled, reducing red tape and sort of having all of these different acts thrown together ultimately may not do justice to those, to each individual change that's made. And I would point out, and I'd like to remind members of the committee and members of the House at every opportunity that I get, that it wasn't too long ago that this PC government decided to actually make some significant changes that actually impacted pieces of legislation that had been in place for many years, and not least of which was the 50/50 transit funding agreement that was in place, and tried to include this as part of other ominous and omnibus bills that were brought forward. This is a concern, and it is a concern because it doesn't allow us to understand as Manitobans the larger context as to which some of these changes were made. And I'll point out in this bill, one of the changes that's being made is with regards to ticket sales and second on the secondary market. This is an issue that is live to many people. It's certainly an issue that we hear throughout the community. And to hear the minister say, well, don't worry, there'll be something else coming. There'll be more legislation coming. Of course, we don't have that legislation before us, and it's not before the House. The minister is simply asking us to trust him once again. And well, I've certainly said my piece on how much we trust the members with regards to some of the words that are being spoken in an election year. So I do think that that needs to be noted and it needs to be pointed out. But as a sort of a larger comment with regards to some of those changes, I do think that there is a lot of room that we can improve that market. So I'm certainly looking forward to that. We will, of course, be moving forward on Bill 11 here at committee, but I do just wanted to put those words on the record and make sure that we were clear that when these kinds of bills are brought forward, we do take them very seriously. We do take the time to read through them and to ensure that there isn't anything in them that that can be harmful or make major changes that aren't sort of as upfront as possible. So with that, I'll close my comments.
We thank the member for those comments. During the consideration of a bill, the enacting clause and title are postponed until all other clauses have been considered in their proper order. Shall Clause 1 pass?
Pass.
Clause 1 is accordingly passed. Shall Clause 2 pass?
Pass.
Clause 2 is accordingly passed. Shall Clause 3 pass?
Pass.
Clause 3 is accordingly passed. Shall Clause 4 pass?
Pass.
Clause 4 is accordingly passed. Shall Clause 5 pass?
Pass.
Clause 5 is accordingly passed. Shall Clause 6 pass?
Pass.
Clause 6 is accordingly passed. Shall the schedule pass?
Pass.
The schedule is accordingly passed. Shall the enacting clause pass?
Pass.
The enacting clause is accordingly passed. Shall the title pass?
Pass.
The title is accordingly passed. Shall the bill be reported?
Agreed.
Agreed. The bill shall be reported. We will now move on to clause by clause of Bill number 26. Does the minister responsible for Bill 26 have an opening statement? The Honorable Minister Gertson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My friend from Concordia asked a question during the second reading portion of this bill regarding whether or not this related to the Environment Act, I believe it was. I think I asked him to provide a specific example. He didn't at the time. He said he might bring one to committee. I'm not sure if he did. But just in general, the changes to the Limitations Act are there to standardize that the limitations is for a 2-year period beginning when an individual becomes aware of the issue on which they might wish to act, not when the actual situation occurred. But there might be in different acts, different specific limitations, and I'm advised that this is not a catch-all, but a backstop, so that if there are acts that don't specifically put in a different limitation, then this act would apply. If there was some sort of an action under an act that had a different limitation period, then that would be the governing limitation period. So I'm not sure that that exactly answered the question for the member, but wasn't able to get a specific example, so I've done my best, as I promised him I would.
We thank the minister for those comments. Does the critic from the official opposition have an opening statement? Mr. Wiebe.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I do appreciate the opportunity to say put a few more words on the record with regards to Bill 26. Bill 26 addresses issues with the Limitations Act, which came into force this past September to replace an outdated act. Specifically, it would allow claimants to start an action 2 years after discovery rather than 2 years after the occurrence of the events it was previously. It also repeals a section of the Public Officers Act, which requires a claim against a public officer be brought forward within 2 years after the event. Limitation periods create a maximum length of time that a claim can be brought against someone since the event occurred. It's important that enough time is allowed for a claim that to be brought forward, especially when the effects may not be noticed for some time. It's also critical that the consultation is done and there's an opportunity to ensure that limitation periods are not preventing legitimate claims from being brought forward. All Manitobans deserve full access to justice, and we'll always stand up to defend this right. We look forward to seeing Bill 26 move forward.
We thank the member for those comments. During the consideration of a bill, the enacting clause and the title are postponed until all other clauses have been considered in their proper order. Also, if there is agreement from the committee, the chair will call clauses in blocks that conform to pages, with the understanding that we will stop at any particular clause or clauses where members may have comments, questions, or amendments to propose. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed and so ordered. Shall clauses 1 and 2 pass? Clauses 1 and 2 are accordingly passed. Shall clauses 3 and 4 pass?
Pass.
Clauses 3 and 4 are accordingly passed. Shall clauses 5 through 7 pass?
Pass.
Clauses 5 through 7 are accordingly passed. Shall clause 8 pass? Clause 8 is accordingly passed. Shall the enacting clause pass? The enacting clause is accordingly passed. Shall the title pass?
Pass.
The title is accordingly passed. Shall the bill be reported?
Agreed.
Agreed. The bill shall be reported. We will now move on to Bill number 34, clause by clause. Does the minister responsible for Bill 34 have an opening statement? The Honourable Mr. Dirksen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. So I want to, I gave pretty detailed comments at second reading, so I won't repeat all of those, but just to address a couple of things. First of all, I want to thank City of Winnipeg Mayor Scott Gillingham for the discussions that we had related to this important bill and his support for it in the development as he campaigned on of a bus transit safety unit, or whatever name they decide to land on, because it really is their name, because ultimately they'll be employing the CSOs. The Department of Justice is responsible for essentially enabling CSOs through training and the powers that are provided, and then the employer would be the City of Winnipeg. So this wasn't established simply for the City of Winnipeg's request. There's been lots of requests from AMM, and they're very supportive of the legislation. And I know that there's a number of municipalities who will take advantage of the enhanced roles of CSOs, and so we're grateful for that support. I also don't want to suggest that this is, and I don't think we ever have, that this is a panacea or some sort of a magic solution for the challenges of crime that exist in Manitoba. But it's been identified as important. We heard that today from representatives of MKO, that the additional enhanced powers are part of the solution, not necessarily the entire solution. I do want to thank Mike Sutherland regarding his comments. I dealt with Mr. Sutherland in the past when he was involved with the WPA, and I know he has a heart for safety and issues around that. The issue around ISOs, though, and he was right to acknowledge that there are 24 or so ISOs that have been trained, the majority working at the U of M, but at least one has been trained through the health system, and we have reason to hope that there'll be more and that they'll be employed by the health system. But as he acknowledged, the transit safety officers are trained by Justice but employed by the City of Winnipeg. The MLCC issue regarding security was ultimately taken on by MLCC. And when it comes to ISOs, the Department of Justice committed to and has delivered an ISO training program, and we're certainly hopeful that health authorities, not just the WRHA, but others, will take advantage of that program. But the Department of Justice is not employing people in the health system or employing people in the Winnipeg Transit system as an example. So this, I want to make that point. The legislation is a continuation, though, of changes to a Police Services Act that were begun under my predecessor, Cameron Friesen, with changes to the IIU, and then we brought in further changes last year regarding police training standards, and now this is a continuation when it comes to layered policing, among other issues that are involved as well. So glad to see the good support that it's received from a variety of different places in Manitoba, not just Winnipeg, not just rural, but in a number of different areas. We're grateful for that support. Look forward to it passing and being a piece of the broader puzzle in terms of providing greater community safety in Manitoba.
We thank the Minister for those comments. Does the critic from the official opposition have an opening statement? Mr. Wiebe.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to Bill 34. And first of all, I just wanted to also thank Mr. Anderson for his time here this evening, and I do appreciate his perspective, and I appreciate that he takes his role very seriously and is doing everything that he can to keep his communities safe that he's responsible for. So very much appreciate that he takes the time to come to committee to put some words on the record. Public safety is certainly a top priority for many communities around the province, and they're looking for answers. They're looking for solutions. It's no question that they've seen an increase in crime and feelings of being unsafe in their communities because of the actions of this PC government. That this has happened completely under their watch, and it's no wonder why it did. Cuts to healthcare, cuts to education services, cuts to addiction services, cuts to housing, cuts to poverty reduction programs. I mean, the list goes on and on. Cuts have consequences, Mr. Chair, and there really are long-lasting impacts to our communities. We hear this certainly in the city of Winnipeg, but we hear it across the province. And again, it's important to hear from our First Nations partners as well, because they're saying the same things. They're looking for solutions, and they're looking for solutions for problems that have been caused by this current PC government. I think it's important that we support those communities. I think Bill 34 would be a step in the right direction, but of course what we're hearing, not just from members who have come here to speak to this committee tonight, but in the written submissions that have been submitted as well, that there are major concerns about supports and funding for these programs going forward. It's one thing to put in legislation, it's another thing to support those communities that wish to implement these tools in their communities. For instance, Mr. Blight from the Association of Manitoba Municipalities, is very clear to say, quote, implementing a CSO program is cost prohibitive for many of our members, particularly smaller municipalities. He goes on to say, there needs to be from the province of Manitoba some financial assistance to help offset costs should a municipality choose to implement the CSO. The written submission from the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs likewise says, as alluded to by, quote, as alluded to by Minister Gertsen in, yeah, I can say that right, as alluded to by Minister Gertsen at the second reading of Bill 34, it is apparent there are insufficient resources for First Nations safety officers to carry out their current role, let alone an expanded role. Likewise, the Southern Chiefs organization talks about how the First Nations safety officers must be supported not only financially but also holistically. So we're seeing this across the board. Municipalities, First Nations are saying this is a step in the right direction. This gives us some of the tools that we need, but ultimately what they're looking for is a partner at the table, a provincial government that actually wants to fix the problems, wants to start coming up with solutions rather than simply talking, using words in an election year, and that's what we're seeing from this government once again. So I do think that this is one element that we look forward to supporting, but we also want to see support for those communities in a larger sense, financially and in other ways. So once again, we remain skeptical that this will be implemented in the way that it needs to, but we will, look forward to seeing this bill pass and move forward.
We thank the member for those comments. During the consideration of a bill, the enacting clause and the title are postponed until all other clauses have been considered in their proper order. Also, if there is agreement from the committee, the chair will call clauses in blocks that conform to pages, with the understanding that we will stop at any particular clause or clauses where members may have comments, questions, or amendments to propose. Is that agreed? Agreed and so ordered. Shall clauses 1 and 2 pass?
Pass.
Clauses 1 and 2 are accordingly passed. Shall clause 3 pass?
Pass.
Clause 3 is accordingly passed. Shall clause 4 pass?
Pass.
Clause 4 is accordingly passed. Shall clause 5 pass?
Pass.
Clause 5 is accordingly passed. Shall clauses 6 through 8 pass?
Pass.
Clauses 6 through 8 are accordingly passed. Shall clauses 9 through 13 pass?
Pass.
Clauses 9 through 13 are accordingly passed. Shall clauses 14 through 16 pass?
Pass.
Clauses 14 through 16 are accordingly passed. Shall clauses 17 and 18 pass?
Pass.
Clauses 17 and 18 are accordingly passed. Shall clauses 19 and 20 pass?
Pass.
Clauses 19 and 20 are accordingly passed. Shall clauses 21 and 22 pass?
Pass.
Clauses 21 and 22 are accordingly passed. Shall clauses 23 through 25 pass?
Pass.
Clauses 23 through 25 are accordingly passed. Shall the enacting clause pass?
Pass.
The enacting clause is accordingly passed. Shall the title pass?
Pass.
The title is accordingly passed. Shall the bill be reported?
Agreed.
Agreed, the bill shall be reported. We will now proceed to clause by clause of Bill number 17. Does the minister responsible for Bill number 17 have an opening statement? The Honorable Ms. Gordon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bill 17 is the Regulated Health Professions Amendment Act, Sub 2. The amendments to the Regulated Professions Act, or RHPA, RAPA, as we refer to it, presented in this bill will enable the minister to take action in the public interest to address issues relating to the administration and operation of a health profession regulatory college that has not yet transitioned to the RHPA or the state of practice of the profession. This will ensure that there are the right tools in the toolkit if they are needed. These amendments do not mean that the department will not continue to work to accelerate the process of bringing health professions under the RHPA. Resources, including a workbook and a guidance document, have been developed to help the colleges complete the work they need to do to transition to the RHPA, and the department will also be considering other options to accelerate the RHPA transition process. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We thank the minister for those comments. Does the critic from the official opposition have an opening statement? Ms. MLA Marcelino.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bill 17 amends the Regulated Health Professions Act to extend the minister's powers relating to inquiries, directives, and orders to the regulatory colleges and associations of health professionals not yet governed under the Act. We support the measures in Bill 17 as it expands the list of professions and regulatory colleges that fall under the purview of the Regulated Health Professions Act. My understanding is that many of these professions have been waiting to be included, and it is good that they finally have this opportunity now. At this time, this being an election year, it is clear that the PCs have been making a lot of announcements about fixing healthcare and fixing the problems they themselves have created over the past 7 years. In general, the file of accreditation of internationally educated professionals, and most pronouncedly with the accreditation of internationally educated nurses, IENs, and international medical graduates, IMGs, this file is not well understood by the PCs, and they are only beginning to play catch up now. The recent February nurse recruitment trip to the Philippines has apparently been very poorly managed, and the province will be seeing significant delays before we'll see any of these nurses that were promised to come here. And there is a lot more that this government needs to do to make our province a place where IENs and IMGs can work towards being an integral part of the health human resources strategy for our province. There are many ways that the province can undo unfair barriers to accreditation that these IENs and IMGs currently are facing. Everything from student loans or student loan programs similar to the current student loans that we have for internationally educated professionals will go a long way to deal with the unfair barriers to accreditation as it relates to finances. Right now, the province has the power to review and amend regulations made by the colleges, and again, this is another way that the province can work to undo unfair barriers to accreditation. It's right here in the Regulated Health Professions Act. It's Section 22 that outlines the province's powers for that. And again, and I've mentioned this before, setting up a nonprofit similar to CARE, C-A-R-E, in Ontario, which is like a support program for nonprofit. It's a nonprofit that helps IENs help navigate this process to accreditation. All these things would be very, very helpful to increase the number of registrations. Right now, we're seeing only about 32 to 36% of all folks that are trying to go through this accreditation process, and that number really, really needs to be higher in order for our province to be able to reap the rewards of having more staffing for our health and human resource strategy here in the province. It's unfortunate the PCs are only taking action during an election year after years and years of cuts, closures, consolidations, frozen wages, and disrespect to our frontline workers and to internationally educated professionals. Thank you.
We thank the member for those comments. During the consideration of a bill, the enacting clause and title are postponed until all other clauses have been considered in their proper order. Shall Clause 1 pass?
Pass.
Clause 1 is accordingly passed. Shall Clause 2 pass?
Pass.
Clause 2 is accordingly passed. Shall Clause 3 pass?
Pass.
Clause 3 is accordingly passed. Shall Clause 4 pass?
Pass.
Clause 4 is accordingly passed. Shall Clause 5 pass?
Pass.
Clause 5 is accordingly passed. Shall Clause 6 pass?
Pass.
Clause 6 is accordingly passed. Shall the enacting clause pass? Oh, sorry. Shall Clause 7 pass?
Pass.
Clause 7 is accordingly passed. Shall the enacting clause pass?
Pass.
The enacting clause is accordingly passed. Shall the title pass?
Pass.
The title is accordingly passed. Shall the bill be reported?
Agreed.
Agreed. The bill shall be reported. The hour being 7:04, what is the will of the committee?
Committee rise.
Committee rise.